It's going to be my pleasure to introduce Dr. Adovasio. This dig was started a long time ago. It was started in 1913, and when the original report was done, it was not accepted by the scientists at the time because they felt that the science work that was done there was incorrect. They thought when Van Sellards estimated that people lived there 13,000 years ago, they said that's not possible. People weren't in this part of the world earlier than 4,000 years ago. So all the reports that were done were just garbage. So what we have to do now, 100 years later, is to offset the bad feelings people have about the site, the stigma that's attached to the site. So that our committee's request was to find someone that is beyond dispute to look at this site, someone who is really experienced and very, very good. So I asked around with prehistorians about who would be the best to come here and to excavate here that would overturn this reputation of the site had. And it was, without any question, Mercyhurst was the one, and Dr. James Adovasio was the person to come. And they're very enthusiastic, very skilled, very hardworking, and a lot of fun to be around. It's been an exemplary experience we've had so far. And Dr. Adovasio is the one who has trained this staff and made it as good as it is. And it makes me a great pleasure introducing Dr. James Adovasio.
What I would like to do is to try to contextualize the Vero project for you by showing you why it was and is important, both for its own sake and in terms of what we are trying to understand about the prehistory of North America. All of you know that on October the 12th, 1492, the soon-to-be styled Admiral of the Ocean Seas, Cristoforo Colon, landed on San Salvador, Samana Cay, and almost immediately encountered Aboriginal inhabitants, the Taino. About these folks, he or members of his entourage posed a series of questions, which in one form or another we've been trying to answer ever since. Who are these people? From whence did they come? What were the route or routes by which they got to North America? Probably most vexatiously, as Randy indicated, when did they initially arrive? And a question that they did not ask, but which we're interested in, what were their lifestyles and behaviors like? Columbus, of course, thought he had the answer to all of these questions already. Convinced as he was that he had landed in the East and not the West Indies, these folks were therefore Indios or Indians. He also said, because based on the traditional interpretation, a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis that applied at the time, they would have always been there. And so a question of homelands, a question of roots, simply didn't matter. In 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama and demonstrated, at least for a learned European audience, that this was an entirely new hemisphere. And so all those questions resurrected themselves again, and speculation began, which persisted for hundreds of years, about where did Native Americans actually come from and when did they get here. You can pick your favorite lost group, and they were alleged to have been the sires of Native Americans. Lost Phoenicians, lost Egyptians, lost Israelites, or if you prefer the other side of the world, lost Japanese, lost Chinese, lost Sri Lankans. In 1590, a Spanish Jesuit priest named José de Acosta published a rather remarkable document called the Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, the natural and moral history of the Indies, in which he identified the area shown on that map, northeastern Siberia, as the probable home of Native Americans. What was remarkable about that observation was the fact that this was over 114 years before Vitus Bering, which sailed through the straits that now bear his name. And if you've ever seen maps of Northeast Asia from that time, the whole area east of the Ural Mountains was simply called Tartary. And for him to have identified this as the homeland of Native Americans was a remarkable thing. He did so based on what he thought was the congruence in the physical appearance of Indians and Northeast Asians. So presumably at some point in his missionary career, even encountered some. Even more remarkably, he said, they would have arrived here via some connection between Siberia and Alaska, which he assumed at the time still existed. It would not be until hundreds of years later where his predictions were verified by archaeological and geological developments that this would actually be proven to be true. In 1648, Thomas Gage, an Englishman, said the same thing. No one believed him either. And consequently, it would not be until a series of developments occurred in Europe that we would be able to better try to address the antiquity of humans in the New World. Those developments involved the appearance of the science of geology in Europe in the 1830s. Between 1831 and 1833, Charles Lyell published Principles of Geology. It would have a monumental effect on thinking, both for scholars interested in earth sciences as well as a variety of other fields. He identified a series of processes which he said had shaped the planet in the past the same way those processes were operational today. And consequently, it meant that the world had to be much more than just 6,000 years old, and that all life on it had to be older than that. Consequently, people began interested in the processes themselves and in their own human antiquity. One of the processes that Lyell identified as having shaped the planet was the impact of glacial activity. What you saw on the previous slide was an erratic, a glacially transported rock in Central Park in New York that had been moved by ice from its original home in New England. Those kind of features existed all over Central and Western Europe. They were traditionally interpreted at the time as being the consequences of Noah's flood. Several scholars rejected this and said, no, it's things like this that you see in the slide that were moving those blocks of rock all that distance, the activity of living glaciers. And the science, if you will, of glacial geology began to develop along with the rest of geology at large. And it was apparent that at different times in the past, though of unknown age, these forces had caused the modern landscape to be much different than they would have been had the ice not been there, to use a complicated subjunctive. But in any case, this is Yosemite. Many of you have been there. Once upon a time, a tributary glacier flowed toward the camera where Bridalveil Falls is located, connected to a main glacier that ran from left to right across that slide. And just as in all parts of the northern hemisphere where there was glacial activity, it sculpted the landscape. It had a profound effect on climate. One of those effects was a rapid decrease in sea level. And in fact, as we'll be talking about momentarily, Florida was 40% bigger than it is now when sea level was down more than 300 feet. And we would not learn until the 1930s and 40s that over the last 2.4, 2.5 million years, there have been at least 9 major glacial cycles when sea level went up and down, exposing land that is now underwater. It's across one of those bridges called the Bering Platform, now under at least 46 meters of water in some places, that the initial peopling of the New World occurred, that the vast majority of folks were able to walk, as Dea Costa said, dry shod across the Bering Straits. A series of excavations conducted in the Low Countries, conducted in France, conducted in southern England, demonstrated the contemporaneity of humans of some sort and Ice Age animals like these. On the upper left, the steppe rhino. On the lower right, the signature animal of the late Ice Age, or in fact most of the Ice Age in the Old World and the New World, in this case a European mammoth, and lots of other animals were found associated with artifacts like this that bear the unmistakable imprint of human modification. Stone tools that could not have had their shapes or their profiles or their outlines mimicked by natural activities. Stone tools that clearly indicated people were contemporaries of those Ice Age animals. One of the problems that Sellards had here at Vero was demonstrating that artifactual material was in fact coeval in age. with some of the Ice Age faunal material that was being found at this particular site. One of the things we are trying to do is, in fact, demonstrate that those artifacts that have been previously recovered, such materials as we will recover, are in fact as old as the animal remains which the site has been producing for over 100 years. In the history of analyzing our behavior in the past, it has been, I regretfully say, dominated by males. 99.9% of the archaeologists working on these kind of problems since the 1820s have been men. And not surprisingly, they have painted pictures in the past that feature, yes, men, and that ignore entirely the old of either gender, the young of either gender, and of course women. And so you're bombarded with images like this one. These people are doing what men are supposed to do. Run around, chase animals, stick whatever you can into them, and then consume them. Here on this side of the Bering Straits, you see Paleo-Indians that represent some of the earliest inhabitants of the New World, those whose compatriots, if you will, are trying to identify at Vero, chasing down a mammoth, throwing a spear into it. As you see here, they're using an atlatl or spear thrower to dispatch caribou or reindeer. And here's something that never happened, but the National Geographic thought that we, the readers of the National Geographic, would like to see this. So you're supposed to believe that somewhere in Central America, somebody managed to excavate a gigantic pit, convince a Colombian mammoth to step into the pit and stand still whilst these pre-steroid muscular males pelted with large rocks, much to the delight of what you have to assume is a little boy in the upper part of the picture who can't wait to grow up to do this same thing. This is my all-time favorite. These are supposed to be Paleo-Indians in the process of dispatching a now extinct version of bear, Arctodus simus, 16 to 20% larger than a Kodiak bear. There's no archaeological evidence these animals were ever hunted. In fact, the artist inadvertently depicted what would happen if you did this by the gentleman in the foreground, who mercifully for his group has left the gene pool permanently. In any case, this more accurate rendering shows Ice Age populations moving from Siberia across Beringia with some of the innovations that would have been necessary for that movement. Artificial structures in an area that would have been scarce in wood, showing the use of bone and reindeer hide coverings, the use of tailored clothing with separate sleeves, leggings, mittens, boots, Eskimo or Inuit or Koryak style gear if you're on the other side of the Bering Straits. What you don't see in this image are the people that would have kept those clothes intact, the women, without which these gentlemen who are staring out at that disappearing herd of elephants under the Aurora Borealis would be naked and dead. By the end of the 19th century, the conventional wisdom was people were not here during the last ice age at all. And so, based on the prevailing wisdom, sites like Vero, when it was discovered and initially excavated, or Melbourne, which is depicted here, were dismissed by the archaeological community as being either poorly excavated or impossibly old. You all know from your respective professions what it is like to run against the conventional wisdom of your field. And that is exactly the situation that Sellards and his compatriots found themselves in, and was unable to shake that until certain basic changes occurred in the field of North American archaeology. This is a view of the early Vero excavations at its obvious location. In 1909, a former slave, George McJunkin, a black cowboy branch manager by that time, outside of the town of Folsom, New Mexico, was out looking for wild or for lost cattle in a place dramatically called Wild Horse Arroyo, and found in the eroding sides of a dry stream bed the bones of some animals that he believed were much too large to be domestic cattle, and even too large for the handful of bison that still lived in the area at the time. The materials found their way by a serendipitous series of events to one of the few scholars in North America who at the time believed in an Ice Age human presence, Jesse D. Figgins at the Denver Museum of Natural History. Figgins went back to the site of McJunkin's discovery and found projectile points like these embedded in the bones of an extinct form of bison, so that by 1926, after the site had been visited by a series of American archaeologists and anthropologists, there emerged a consensus that people had in fact been here during the last ice age. The question became, how much earlier than the McJunkin discoveries were they here? What in fact were their lifestyles like? In 1933, in another series of excavations in New Mexico, projectile points, spear points like the ones you see in the lower left of this image, were found associated with, intermixed with the remains of extinct elephants in deposits beneath those which produced those Folsom projectile points and the remains of extinct bison. By 1948, when radiocarbon dating was invented, these kinds of projectile points had been found widely distributed throughout much, but not all, of North America, down into Central America, into South America. Their radiocarbon dating suggested that they had been manufactured between about 11,300 and 10,900 radiocarbon years ago, or in calendar years, roughly 2,000 years more than those. And the makers of these points were viewed as not only the first people into the New World, but of having led a lifestyle dependent upon the pursuit of now extinct Ice Age animals. Between those dates, they are alleged to have been responsible for the extinction of more than 30 genera of Ice Age animals, the biggest killing event in the history of the world. American male archaeologists loved it. Okay. Yet another demonstration that we do things better on this side of the Atlantic than anyone does anywhere else. European prehistorians were skeptical. South American prehistorians were skeptical. The American response was, those guys on the other side of the Atlantic don't have any idea what they're talking about. Those guys in South America don't even speak English. I'm going to very briefly show you some images of one of the archaeological sites that was instrumental in destroying the Clovis paradigm, the idea that the makers of those projectile points were in fact the first Americans. It was the first serious challenge to that particular point of view that emerged in the 1970s. But it's important for all of you who are interested in Vero to know that the field methods, the protocols, the laboratory techniques that we're employing here were developed, refined during the 40-year excavations at Meadowcroft. I also want to point out that this whole idea, as you've seen if you visited the site, of working indoors was essentially developed here because the site was enclosed almost from the beginning so that people could work undisturbed by the elements. The site was protected from vandals or the accumulation of leaves or anything else. That's a view of Meadowcroft before the creation of the recent visitor center. It's a phenomenal thing to see. The visitor center cost almost $2.5 million, and it represents, if you are interested in archaeological sites and how they are approached and excavated, a place that is well worth going to if you find yourself in remote Washington County, Pennsylvania. In any case, for a variety of reasons, when we first saw the site in the early 1970s, we determined the possibility of humans having lived there to be very high. We solicited permission from the landowners, began to conduct a series of excavations there in 1973 before the building was erected, and subsequently all the way up to the present, that demonstrated there were almost 16 feet, more than 4 meters of deposit there that represented thousands of separate visits by prehistoric populations who used this as a fall hunting and plant collecting location. And since the earliest materials from the site were considerably older than that Clovis horizon of 10,900 to 11,300 years, like Vero, in its time, the Meadowcroft discoveries were questioned by the archaeological establishment, not on the grounds of the protocols used in the excavation, but rather in terms of the fact that it, quote, could not be that old, unquote. And this is pretty much what the 16 feet of modern deposits look like, but I bring to your attention both the use of the tags, the use of the methods of microstratigraphic excavation. It would be as if you had a multi-layered dessert in front of you with 25 separate little layers in it, and you're peeling them off not 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 at a time, but you're peeling them off one at a time. That's in fact what Andy and Annie and the crew at Vero are doing now. We're in the process of systematically peeling back the past in very, very, very small increments. This is ridiculously time-consuming. It requires demented personalities. And for those of you that are on the crew, and I know there's some of you at every table who know how demented you actually are, who are willing to do this and to process the kind of materials that we expect to get in this excavation. The Meadowcroft excavations produced 956,000 animal bones, 1.4 million plant remains that are still being analyzed. And we don't expect this particular project to be over anytime soon. And needless to say, the kind of laboratory capabilities, the kind of students, the kind of personnel you need to do this cost a lot of money. In 1970s dollars, the Meadowcroft excavations cost almost $2.7 million to do. I'll leave to you the idea of figuring out what that is in modern dollars. But in any case, we learned to control the lighting at Meadowcroft. We're controlling the lighting at this excavation so that the excavators can maximize or minimize particular combinations of light and shadow. In the early part of the site at Meadowcroft, which is the southeastern portion shown in these slides, there's a series of fire pits, the oldest of which are more than 16,000 radiocarbon years old. Now, since those discoveries, other early sites have been found in North and South America demonstrating that the initial movement of people into this hemisphere occurred well before the Clovis horizon, perhaps in the mid to high 20,000s of years ago. These are some of the early materials from Meadowcroft. Similar things have been found up and down now the East Coast, in parts of Texas. Contemporary but unrelated forms have been found in South America. It represents the kind of stone tool technology that these populations would have been using. And what we're trying to do in Florida are two separate things. We have an underwater project that Andy is in charge of on the West Coast, which is designed to look at the submerged continental shelf so that we can understand what some of the earliest denizens of the Florida landscape were doing roughly at the same time Meadowcroft and other sites like it were being lived in. And here is the radiocarbon sequence from Meadowcroft, 52 dates, beginning well before a human presence, running up to AD 1776. We hope to be able to run a comparable series of dates for our work not only offshore and underwater, but also here at Vero, to be able to tie down issues of when did the first Floridians get here, what was the environment like, what were the kinds of plants and animals living in this part of the world, contemporaneously with some of those other early sites that we have worked on in the past. Likewise, on the West Coast, the underwater work is addressing what the earliest people in that area are doing in much the same fashion. The point of all this is relatively simple. To understand what your forebears were doing on the Florida landscape requires hyper-precise excavation methodology. It requires a concomitant devotion to an ideal that lets us look at individual bits of data in such a way as to extract every last piece of information from them that we can about what their creators were doing. Not just their male creators, obviously, but those who are working with perishable artifacts, which in the underwater environments of Florida, particularly in the Panhandle, have produced an incredible array of items other than just stone. Some of the excavations, like those at Slough Hole and elsewhere, have produced, in addition to various kinds of Paleo-Indian projectile points, a remarkable assortment of bone artifacts, in some cases artifacts made out of plant fiber and other materials. We expect fully to find things like this in the Vero excavations. We hope to be able to demonstrate that not only were the activities of stone-wielding males, if you will, important in the early prehistoric adaptations to this area, but also, and in fact, what their consorts, what their children, and what their parents were doing at the same time. Another assortment of bone tools from other Florida sites gives you the smallest flavor if you will, of what these people were doing prehistorically. That's the vessel that we use from FIO for our underwater work on the West Coast. Those scenes that I'm quickly going through for you are the bottom, if you will, on the lake glacial margin 300 feet down, showing beaches that have not been walked on in more than 16,000 years. So the landscapes that we're looking at submerged, the landscape that we're looking at Vero is very, very different than the landscape to which we have been accustomed, but we are only the most recent inhabitants of this landscape. And what we're trying to find out are those previous folks who would have been walking around on those beaches, who would have been walking around at Vero, who would have been doing these kinds of things. That's Andy clutching a piece of raw material from an offshore site, examples of which have also been found in terrestrial sites here on the Florida mainland. Even if we were not to require, or would not recover a single prehistoric artifact, the kind of plant and animal material informs us, if you will, of the nature of the Florida environment, perhaps as early as 13 or 14,000 years ago. It adds a piece to an emerging puzzle that lets us see what our forebears, whether you're a Native American or not, were involved in the successful colonization of the hemisphere. That's an actual human footprint from an early archaeological site in South America. We have all seen the Indiana Jones movies. We all appreciate the fact of the romance of the field, or you wouldn't be here unless you were bamboozled into being here by your consort or some other relative. You have some basic interest in archaeology, and you understand that those movies don't depict the tedium, don't depict the boredom, don't depict the filling out of field notes, don't depict why our field crew will have to be committed at the end of the project in May to recuperate. This human footprint is a footprint of an individual whose ancestors, at some point in the past, realized for the first time that all the smoke was behind them. That they were the very first people in an entire new continent, facing a different set of plant and animal communities, facing perhaps the same problems that they faced in Siberia, but in a very different way. Ultimately, the descendants of whoever's parents and whose ever children made those footprints work their way through the hemisphere. We will discover, and have discovered, that it's not just about what men were doing. You've got to love this. It's one of my favorite glacial slides. The guy on the right, the nice off-shoulder parka in the dead of winter. And the guy on the left doing what all of you guys really want to do is hack off raw meat with a stone tool and eat it. And this equally jarring image, this time of a woman during the last ice age in Central Europe, using a net, using fiber, using non-stone to dispatch an animal. Well, for a change, the guy in the background isn't doing a damn thing. What we hope to extract from Vero is a reconstruction showing a Clovis community, a man, a woman, his children. The successful colonization of the New World required the cooperation of the entire social unit. In order to get here to Vero, in order to get to Monteverde in South America, in order to get to the tip of South America, it obviously wasn't just men. And the material remains of that colonization event, the biggest one in the history of the world, that will likely ever occur again unless we leave the planet, does in fact require the entire social unit. The preservational circumstances at Vero should illuminate that entire social unit, should provide the kinds of material that not only lets us see the environmental background, but the operation of human beings within that background. And that's why the site is so unique. It's not just about demonstrating that yes, Sellards was right 100 years ago. It's about adding a piece of information to the greatest colonization event in the history of the world. There is not a group like this any other place in the United States that I know of. There might be a citizens group in some South Carolina town that's interested in restoring a Confederate prisoner of war camp. There might, no, there's nothing wrong with this. I'm just saying that this group, with an interest in an early prehistoric site, has no parallel. The kinds of things that you're trying to do here have never been done before in the 50 or the 48 contiguous or 50 United States. So you yourselves deserve a round of applause just for the fact that you have an interest in this particular set of activities. And again, we're not generating treasure here, except in the sense that the kind of materials that we find are nuggets, if you will, of knowledge that provide us, when they are smelted, the ability to tell stories like this hundreds of years into the future, to understand better how and why we got to be where we are. Churchill observed that you can't know where you're going in the future unless you know where you're going in the past. Thanks to your contributions, we know a little more about where we've been in the past. Thank you.